Hey, everybody. It's me, Uncle Herbie, and this is the second podcast of Wisdom After the Fall. In the initial podcast, which almost nobody saw, I find this whole thing kind of amusing. I understand that I have a total viewership of, like at this point, a dozen. And, you got to crawl before you walk and walk before you run. So I find the whole thing kind of amusing, really. But I feel I have a lot to share in all seriousness, and that's what I'm going to do today. So in the inaugural podcast, and this podcast is topical but not political. Although it can be political, I might this, I'll. It's going to depend on what I want to talk about, but it's the wisdom that's resulted from being at the very top, falling to the very, very bottom, and it's all my fault. And I told you that I was a criminal in the very first podcast, and I told you what I did and that I was guilty of doing it. And I saved why I did it and how I did it. Well, not how I did it. I'm not going to teach you how to be a criminal. That's not going to happen. But why I did it, I'm going to talk about now. But before I do, and before I get into my own background and the things that happened, I want you to understand the reason I'm doing this. First of all, this is not to provide an excuse for what I've done. This is going to be an ugly story. This is not for children. Having said that, it's not an entirely unique story, and I am not the only person by a long shot that's ever gone through this. One of the things that I want to do with this podcast, and that was me bumping into the tripod, so it'll stop shaking in a second. One of the things that I want to accomplish with this podcast is for those of you that perhaps have gone through something like this, so that you know you're not alone. It's kind of like the value of going to a 12-step program. Not that I've ever been to one because I don't have a chemical problem, but I had a relative that did, and I did go to meetings. And it's the value that I could see was that everybody kind of found out that as bad as their situation was, there was always somebody that had it worse. I mean, I'm probably simplifying this an awful lot. So in no way is the story I'm about to tell you meant as an excuse. I think thousands, if not millions of people have gone through similar trials and circumstances, and they didn't become criminals. So let's not confuse explanation with mitigation or excuse. Okay, I did what I did. I have incredible shame around it. It was my fault. I knew what I was doing. I understood right from wrong. Let us not go where so many people go these days, which is into victimhood. I'm not a victim. In fact, in some ways, what happened to me made me stronger. But you'll understand that as I go into the story. So the story really begins. I was born in Miami Beach, Florida. My mother divorced my natural father when I was 2 years old. I have no memory of him at all. I kind of have a vague, kind of fuzzy memory of being picked up by a man who I'm pretty sure was my father in the Florida room of our house on Alton Road in Miami Beach. And I want to say that's it. That's the only memory I have. I never spoke to him since. I'll get to how I know more about him later, but that was the end of my relationship with him through my childhood. I had zero contact with my father, and my mother had told me that the reason she had divorced my father was that he was an ultra-Orthodox Jew and was going to raise me in payasses. For those of you who don't know what payasses are, those are those curly things that go down the side where you see the guys in the beards and the hats. So this is what I thought. I never really put together, why would my mother marry a Hasidic Jew? Somehow I just went with this story. She divorced my father, and he didn't want custody. Since I wasn't going to be raised Orthodox Jewish, I was going to be raised Reform, which Reform is to Jewish as Unitarian is to Christian. It's very loosey-goosey. I mean, it's not an exact analogy, or parallel, but it's pretty close. So anyway, and I've known that there are ultra-Orthodox Jews that really will go off the deep end if you leave the group, I guess. So, but they're the smallest. I realize they're visible, and people sometimes think that that's what Jews look like, but that's the teeniest, tiniest little part of Judaism. But that's what I was told that I was going to be raised in. And my mother, to save me, I was told, divorced him, and then we lived in Miami Beach in a house that my grandfather, who was wealthy, my grandfather was a potato shipper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was a Russian Jewish immigrant who had come to America in the early teens. And it was this classic, it was a Horatio Alger story, but it was more like Horatio Pasikoff, which was my mother's maiden name. And he went from being a huckster, which is a guy in the street with a cart, to owning a full block. In fact, the building that was once his warehouse, Pasikoff and Sons, is today this big thing in Pittsburgh full of restaurants and things down in what used to be the produce yards on Smallman Street. That was my grandfather's warehouse. He was a big deal in the potato business. He was called the Potato King. And in fact, when my mother was born, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran a little article that said that the Potato King and his wife had given birth to the Potato Princess. And my mother, for the rest of her life, identified as the Potato Princess, which is also the title of one of the 12 books that I wrote while I was in prison. So I said that they were all fiction. I guess this one isn't either, but that's another story. I haven't published it. But anyway, so my mother was, make a long story short, I spoke Spanish before I spoke English. That's just as a side note, because my mother had a degree in Spanish from Chatham College in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a minor in French. Foreign languages run in our family, something that I inherited. And anyway, long story short, she was the bilingual teller at Miami Beach Federal Savings and Loan, and we had a Cuban housekeeper in those days that my grandfather paid for, because obviously she couldn't have done it on the salary as the bilingual teller at Miami Beach Federal Savings and Loan. But my grandfather, like I said, was wealthy and took care of us. And around the corner lived my aunt and uncle, my mother's sister. She had 6 siblings, one of whom was dead. That's the one I'm named after. Jews don't do juniors. They name their kids after dead people. So I'm named after Herbert Ivan Pasikoff, and I'm Herbert Ivan K. See the Russian middle name, Russian Jewish, you get it. Anyway, long story short, that was the story until I was 5 years old. At 5 years old, I wasn't aware of it. My mother, I remember dating. I remember she dated a guy named Josh Becker. She dated a guy named, I love this guy's name, Roland Kindheart. There's a lot of cute stories, but I'm not going to go into all of that. She drove a little yellow Nash Rambler with red leather upholstery. It was a convertible. It was really cute. It was a happy time in our lives. And I loved living in Miami Beach as a little boy. And I have lots of, even though it was early in my life, I have lots of clear memories. That's my aquarium vibrating. I have a little nano aquarium on my desk where I have little shrimp and little snails, and it's one of my little habits. Anyway, hobbies, not a habit, it's a hobby. Anyway, where was I? So anyway, life was great, but at 5 years old, my mother got married. Now, I had never met the guy that she married, my stepfather. And as it turns out, I discovered later it was an arranged marriage. She had known him less than 2 weeks. My grandfather, who was very old school, and I know this sounds positively draconian, but I don't know if he had to force her, but she basically worshiped her father, my grandfather. I did too, by the way. I loved my grandfather, although he died when I was 6 years old. And then my grandmother was dead by the time I was 9, and that was it for my grandparents. And I had no paternal grandparents that I was aware of other than my stepfathers, and I'm not going to bother with that story. It's not a bad story, but I'm just not going to bother with it. To make a long story short, Samuel K., whose name I now carry because I was legally adopted by him, my mother told me that my father didn't want me to carry his last name, so to let my stepfather legally adopt me. This was all a lie, by the way, but I bought this hook, line, and sinker, and I went along with this. So what choice did I have? I was a child. So, and I was told that I was to call him Father, or as he liked for me to call him, Fafa, and the abuse started almost immediately. So after my grandfather died and he felt unshackled, I guess. Now, let me make very clear, Samuel K. was never violent to my mother, and he was never violent to his own daughter, who came along later, my half-sister Laura. But again, I'm not going to go into my familial relationships and what they are today and so on and so forth, not because they're bad or good or otherwise, but because they're irrelevant to the story, and I'm not going to bring people into it that don't need to be into it unless they're part of the timeline. So anyway, she marries him. She doesn't even know him. My grandfather, we moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My grandfather owns a string of duplexes on a street called Beeler Street, which runs off of Wilkins Avenue, which is around the corner from where my grandfather lived. And just down the street, for those of you who are currently aware, from the Tree of Life Synagogue, where the shooting took place not too long ago of the crazy Nazi. But in those days, there weren't crazy Nazis shooting up the Tree of Life Synagogue, which we in any case did not belong to because that's a conservative synagogue. And we belonged to the Reform Synagogue, which was Beth Shalom, I believe, in Squirrel Hill, which was next door to where we lived. But anyway, long story short, we lived on Beeler Street in this duplex. Until my grandfather died, my mother inherited money, and then we moved out to the suburbs. Now, when we lived on Beeler Street, I went to a private school for gifted children. It was, from the very start, I was very, very smart and very, very precocious. And I had to be tested and so on and so forth. And as a result of those tests, I went to a school for gifted children. It was part of the University of Pittsburgh. It's called the Falk. In those days, it was called the Falk School. I think it still exists. I haven't bothered to follow up. I don't know if it does the same thing it used to, but in those days, it was a school for gifted children. So I went to school with a bunch of other little nerds like me. And even though I was a major league nerd, I didn't know it because everybody else was too. My best friend was Teddy Vassar. My first girlfriend, Zori Firkin. It was really a happy time. And from 5 until 9 years old, we lived there. But as soon as my grandfather died, the abuse started from Sam K. And first it started with beatings. He had a wild, wild temper. And I could relate a lot of stories, but I will just relate one. And he just was a lunatic when it came to this. One day, it was a hot summer day, and my mother didn't feel like cooking. So on his way home from work, and he was a produce broker. How this whole arrangement took place was Sam K worked for a company called C.H. Robinson, which is a truck and produce broker. It still exists, a big company. I think it's publicly traded. He worked in the produce yards across the street from where my grandfather's warehouse was. My grandfather saw him as an up-and-comer. He didn't understand. If my grandfather had known what Sam K did to me later, my grandfather would have murdered him. I'm 100% sure of it, but that's another story. My grandfather was dead at this point, and so he was never aware. So there you go. So anyway, so Sam, he brought home a pizza from a place called Minio's. It was a great pizza parlor in Pittsburgh. I think it's still there. Anyway, long story short, the cheese on the pizza was very, very hot and very, very melty, and it was sliding off my pizza. So I took a fork to put the cheese back on the pizza, and Sam K said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm putting the cheese back on the pizza." I know I'm talking fast, but this is just a quick anecdote. And he said, "You're lying." And I knew that was the code word that would set him off. If he thought I ever lied to him, he would go ape. So I, being a little boy of, I think, maybe 7 years old or 8 years old, I ran for the stairs, at which time he picked up the chair he was sitting in and threw it at me across the room, missing me by inches. As I ran up the stairs, the chair went through the wall. I went up to my room. I closed and locked my door. And then I crawled out my window onto the roof, and he knocked my door down and followed me onto the roof, dragged me in by my hair, and beat the living shit out of me. That's a pretty typical Sam K story. And he was a very, very violent man. But that's not the half of it. Okay, now when he wasn't violent, he was very denigrating. And he used to call me stupid and this and that. Now, I now realize, looking back on it, I just threatened the shit out of this guy. My very existence threatened the shit out of this guy, and I was the apple of my mother's eye. And in a weird way, you're gonna, the first question I would ask if I was being told this story is, "Where was your mother?" And my mother was so obedient to my grandfather that her obedience to his choice of Sam K took precedent over what was going on with me. But the worst was yet to come. Okay, and I'm going to go through this story fast because the gory details are unnecessary. You're going to get it from the high points. Yada, yada, yada. We're living in suburban Pittsburgh in an area called Mount Lebanon on Navajo Drive. Lots of other things had taken place. He had already started with the sexual thing. It hadn't gotten really bad yet. He was just grabbing at my penis in the car as we would drive down the street, and he was grooming me. He would. And at the very same time, and my family now, if they were to watch this video, would say, but he got so many gifts. That's what groomers do. They do horrible things and they buy you shit. They do horrible things and they buy you shit. And he had access to a lot of money because my mother inherited a shit ton of money when my grandfather died. And so suddenly we were wealthy. And my mother drove a Cadillac, and we lived in a big stone house in the suburbs, and yada, yada. And so, on one hand, he would beat the shit out of me. On the other hand, he would denigrate the shit out of me. And on the other hand, he would be constantly going after my penis and telling me that he would ask me weird things. Like, "Do you and your friends ever get in a circle and masturbate together? Or do you and your friend," and again, that's where, as far as the graphic is going to go. Okay, in that story. But it was like, and I would go, "Oh God, no." And then he would drop it, and then he would come back to it. And he was always, and it got to the point where I couldn't sit in the seat next to him in the car. But he would beat me if I wanted to go in the back seat, because I would either get beaten or molested, depending on, when I say molested, he was constantly grabbing for my penis and telling me how cute it was and all this kind of crap. Anyway, these are painful memories. So my mother, who ultimately died at the age of 50 of kidney cancer, had some warning signs, I think, early on. And one of them was, we were visiting my cousin Peter. At the time, the Vietnam War was going on. My cousin Pete, cousin by marriage, was married to my cousin Janie, who was my mother's niece by her sister Madeline. You don't have to remember any of that. It's in The Potato Princess, the book that I will share with you. One day I'll publish it, but it's not ready yet. Anyway, but Peter was a major in the Army because he was an orthopedic surgeon. He was stationed at Fort Belvoir. We went to visit him at Fort Belvoir, staying nearby in a hotel, of course. My mother got a terrible kidney infection. Peter had her admitted to Georgetown University Hospital, where she had to remain over a week with this serious infection. I had to go to school. My little sister, who had been born at this point, so I'm 7 years old, she was 2. She stayed with my mother, Janie, and Peter in Washington, my mother being in the hospital, Janie taking care of Laura. And I went back to Pittsburgh with Sam, and that's when the real horror show took place. So, in fact, I think I was 11. I'm a little messed up on my age and timeline. These are not things I often try to retrace in my mind. Those of you who have had to go through this may appreciate this. I think I was 10 or 11. Anyway, we went back to the house in Pittsburgh. Yeah, definitely. I was still in elementary school. I was still going to Stephen C. Foster Elementary School. Yeah, for sure. Anyway, we went back, and Sam kept a huge stash of alcohol in our basement. And he used to say he was buying it for my bar mitzvah. We never served any of it at my bar mitzvah. But to make a long story short, it was enormous. He used to like collect it. He was almost a hoarder of it. The funny thing is, he was never an alcoholic. He wasn't a drinker at all. He would have one gin and tonic, maybe 2, when he would come home. It was mostly like a collection. But we lived in an Irish Catholic neighborhood, and we had a lot of people over all the time, and some stereotypes are true, and they would come over and drink all the time, and my parents liked to entertain them, and so on and so forth. So we had a lot of alcohol in the house. He brought up a bottle of Chivas Regal. He got me drunk, he put me in the bed, and he raped me. Now I'm gonna not go into any more details than that. But this was way over the line of just grabbing at me, and I was appalled. And because I think I was very fortunate in that I wasn't really his son and always knew it. And by this point, I hated him. I hated him like I couldn't even put into words hate. Oh, I went along with the Fafa and I love you, Fafa, and all this shit because I was terrified of him at the same time, but I hated him. And I was growing, I didn't recognize it at the time, but I was growing to hate my mother because she was protecting him, not me. But then I decided I was going to pull the rug out in this whole thing. I told you I was precocious. So I got hold of my mother's Rolodex, and I called my cousin Janie, my Aunt Madeline, my Uncle Phil, who she was married to, Peter. I called Sam's boss, Jippy Pomosi at C.H. Robinson, and I told them all, and his wife, Martha Pomosi. I don't know what's happened to them since, but I'm sorry to use your last name, but they'll corroborate the story. Anyway, long story short, I told them everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything in graphic detail. And of course, it exploded when my mother got home, but not the way you would think. I got a lecture in, don't embarrass your father. Don't create a Shanda für die Goyim, a scandal for the non-Jews. That's what that means. He didn't mean it. He's going to take Valium. He's going to get help and treatment. You can't tell anybody about this ever again. In other words, she protected him and made me into a secret keeper, which had deep, deep psychological impacts. Now, I'm going to stop with the horror story. So now you understand that I was beaten, denigrated, and molested. And that's all you need to know. And this went on until I was about, well, what happened was we ended up having to leave Pittsburgh because I think, now that I see it in 2020 hindsight, I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Jimmy Pomosi, who we were very close to, suddenly we were not close to, and we ended up in Nogales, Arizona. But I ended up moving to Miami Beach with my aunt and uncle. That's another story for another day, but it saved my life in many ways. But the damage had been done. And I was, for lack of a better term, fucked up. And I lived in 2 different realities at the same time. In one reality, my objective reality, the one I lived in, was a horror show. So in order to escape it, I developed this habit of living in this off-kilter second reality, which was a little ahead in time. I was always in the future. I was never in the moment I was in. And that future was always bright and optimistic and good things were going to happen. And that's how I coped. And just fast forwarding, the only person that ever really caught me doing it was my youngest daughter, Chloe. He used to call it Channel 1 and Channel 2. And she didn't understand the reasons why. She was a little girl, but very perceptive. And she used to come up to me and go, Daddy, Channel 1, because she wanted me to pay attention to her. And a lot of times I was present for things, but I was never present all the way up till the shit hit the fan. Now, Something about prison and going all the way down the drain and having my world explode around my head um, snapped me out of it. I don't know any other way of putting it. But up until now, recent times, since I was released in 2019, I lived on Channel 1 and Channel 2. And because I lived in Channel, and here comes, this is not the excuse, this is how I committed the crime. Channel 2 was Happy Land. And I could talk myself into believing any bullshit in Happyville. And that's where I lived. I lived in that all the time. It was unconscious. It was compulsive. It was a compulsive behavior. People who go through, I've learned over the years, because I've done a lot of work with professionals over the years about being a survivor of incest and abuse and so on and so forth. One of two things happens with people like me. Either we curl up into a fetal position, metaphorically speaking, and sometimes literally speaking, and our lives become ruined. These are the people that are just live isolated lives, no family, no friends, no girlfriend, no boyfriend, unable to socially connect. Oftentimes sex addicts, oftentimes become very hypersexual. That's a very, very common theme in survivors of incest, and for a while I was too. Although anyway, I won't go there. But a long story, it's just not necessary. You're getting the drift of this. But in this secondary reality I lived in, this alternate reality, everything always worked out, and I was also fairly talented. So from the time that I was discharged from the Navy in 1979 to the time the shit hit the fan in 2015, pretty much, I was successful, and I always kind of pulled it out at the end. I remember that the president of the National Bank of Tucson once paid me a really nice compliment behind my back. It got back to me behind my back, but it was one of the nicest things anyone ever said to me. But it made me tell. His name was Mike. God rest his soul. I think he's gone now, but he was a wonderful guy. And Mike once said about me behind my back, Herbie is out of his mind, will take crazy risks, but he always pays. Unfortunately, I got to the point where I couldn't pay anymore, but I used to always pay. And I did always take crazy risks, because the other thing was, the other result of, the other half of the people, by the way, who go through what I go through end up like me, become hyperachievers and become hypersexual and very, very, very manipulative and really, really good at pressing people's buttons. I became really good at unconsciously pressing people's buttons. And the reason why is because I spent my childhood from the age of 5 until I left home and joined the Navy, basically. There's other things in between and going to Florida and so on and so forth. But again, not important to the story. To the time that I divorced myself from my home life, where was I going with this? God, I forget. I completely lost my train of thought. This is what it is to be an old person. I completely lost my train of thought. But, here we go. I usually want, and so, why I'm hyperintuitive and why I'm highly manipulative and why people like me become there we go. Came back. See if you just relax for a minute. That was a demonstration in what happens when you're almost 70 years old. Although I think that was happening to me all along because my head's always busy. But anyway, I spent my childhood trying to read a psychopath, trying not to set Sam K off, trying not to be sexually molested, trying not to be denigrated. And in doing so, the problem is he's a psychopath, and you can't read a psychopath. But you become excellent at reading everybody who isn't, because every little nuance, every little facial tic, every little move in the room, people would notice sometimes how, for example, how I would notice everything. I'm one of those people that notices everything. And when I walk into a room, I just instinctively scan it, see it, and record it. And I have not a photographic memory, but near photographic memory, and I have near total recall, and I'm an oral learner. I'm one of the, there are different kinds there are people that learn by reading. There are people that learn by, my son John is a tactile learner. He has to be hands-on. I'm an oral learner. I learn best by listening. I used to never, for example, take notes in lectures because I remember everything anyway, and that way, and I didn't want to divert my attention because I was learning. And to this day, I can repeat back to you lectures. I can recite the Lorelei in German that I learned in high school, verbatim, and I've had no, ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, dass ich so traurig bin. Those of you who know the poem know that that's the first line of the poem. But anyway, long story short, I just remember everything. And combine that combine high intelligence with an ability to read everybody in the room and absolutely no fear. Once I asked the therapist, how come I'm not afraid of anything? This is what led me to be a big risk taker. I just don't really experience fear like most people. Now, I experience horrible empathetic fear. So in other words, if I sense that anybody I love, when I say anybody, it can be human or four-legged, but if anybody I love, if I sense there's any danger to them in any way, fear fills me immediately, okay? But for myself, I don't have any. It's how in prison I was able to stare down Nazis. I'd look them right in the eye and say, go fuck yourself. And there's something about when someone who doesn't show fear looks you in the eye and tells you to go fuck yourself, it's much more meaningful than when they see fear. It's like a dog, a dog sensing fear in someone else. I just don't experience it. But that translated into me being a crazy risk taker. So when you combine that I was highly manipulative, I lived in an alternate reality where everything always worked out in my favor. And for years it did, for decades it did. I got too big for my britches. I got way out ahead of my skis. I didn't recognize what I was doing. And by the time I did, I didn't have the strength of character after a lifetime of being a dented can to pull the plug when I should have. And that's how I ended up being a criminal. Now, none of that is an excuse. Everything I told you, and if those of you who are recoiling in horror at this moment, at this story, and saying to yourself, oh my God, here's the thing. I am far from alone. And yet the other thing you get is kind of a sonar, a radar for other victims. And I can spot a victim of child abuse and particularly incest a mile away. And if you want to meet one today, all you have to do is internet date. That's where they're hanging out. I told you, hypersexual at every age. Oddly enough, I've become voluntarily a voluntary incel, a volcel. I'm not an incel, I'm a volcel. Yeah, I've learned the best way to control my impulses is don't indulge them. What can I tell you? And I'm perfectly happy doing that. That's about all I'm going to share today. That is the story of how it came about. That's the story, the ugly, ugly story. And that's the last I'm going to share of it. Now, before we go, of course, like, subscribe, click the bell. And if you go to my Patreon or buy me a coffee, I will send you a free copy of this. And I think it's an important book. It's called A Radical Reset. I wrote this in prison. And this is a prescription for what ails us in this country and how to fix it. We have been sold a bill of goods. This is not a political statement, my friends. I do not care if you are a Democrat or Republican. Don't care. This isn't about Democrats and Republicans. This isn't about Donald Trump or what's the guy in New York? The mayor. Shows you how much I pay attention. Mamdani. That's not what this is about. This is about how can we fix our society from someone who has a very unique perspective. I've seen it from the very, very top to the very, very bottom. Now, this is available on Amazon as well. You can go on Amazon, and when I'm editing this later, I will try to put up the link, like I know what I'm doing, and you can go buy it directly on Amazon. Or if you subscribe through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, you'll get a free copy of the book. Now, I'll be honest with you, I haven't fleshed out what I'm going to do with my Patreon group and the special benefits I'm going to offer. Rest assured that I will allow that I'm going to crawl, walk, and run, and I'm a one-man operation. But if you could possibly see a way to help support, that would be so super. And by the way, most of the money I get goes to restitution and will for the rest of my life, and that's okay too, because I did it, and that's that. Not only do I accept it, I embrace it. To me, I told you in the first video, all I really care about at this point in my life is earning redemption. And if I can help you, and at the same time earn a little redemption for me, then we both win. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a beautiful next few days. I'll post another episode in a couple of days. And in the meantime, peace out. Take care.